Chapter 4. Silently I slithered up the crest of the hill, pulling myself along the ground with my elbows. Commando style. Pete was a little behind me because the fringe on his buckskin shirt kept snagging on bushes. I motioned him forward, and he wriggled up beside me, keeping low. Together we parted the grass and peered down at the enemy camp. It had been easy following the girls back. We'd stayed a safe distance behind them, keeping under cover and following their voices. They'd never suspected a thing. 2 tents, I whispered. 1 for the girls, I guess, and 1 for the aunt. Pete nodded. That should make it easy. The girls weren't in sight, but we could hear their muffled voices mixed with a lot of laughter coming from inside one of the tents. We listened, but all we could catch were a few snatches of their conversation. Snatches like moose, duck, moosey-woosey, ducky-wucky, hilarious, and I thought I was going to die. I gritted my teeth and studied their camp. The 2 tents were set up far apart at either end of a large clearing by the lake. The big one at the far end was khaki-colored and looked as if it had been on about 100 African safaris. The canvas was scruffy and worn and was covered with all sorts of patches, but the tent itself was all ship-shape and taut. It had a large canvas awning that stretched out from the front and was held up by 2 poles. In the shade of the awning were a small folding table with some books scattered on it, a canvas stool, and a tripod for a camera. The tent nearer to us was a modern one, a 2-man A-frame made of red nylon. It was the one the girls' voices were coming from. Between the tents, but set forward near the lake, was a stone fire ring with an iron gate. The shoreline was curved and rocky, with a tiny stretch of sand at the far end near the big safari tent. 2 canoes were beached on the sandy spot. Also at the far end, tied between 2 trees, was a clothesline, with 2 t-shirts and a pair of white socks hung out to dry. I was busy gauging the distance between the forest and the lake when suddenly the girls came bursting out of their tents, still laughing. At us, of course. Pete and I must have been the best entertainment they had seen in years. Funny, muttered Pete in a low voice. They think they're so low, cried the one named Jill, gesturing grandly at her friend. It is I, Mighty Moose. Behold, replied Sunny, her arms thrown wide. It is I, Dummy Duck. Pete made a choking sound and started over the hill. I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. Hear me, O Duck, said Jill. Why are thy tennis shoes so wet and squishy? Because, O Moose, I must have fallen into the stormy sea. After all, they do not call me Dummy Duck for nothing. Naturally, they practically choked to death, laughing over that one. Then they went on for a while longer, more or less in the same vein. Pete and I tried to stay calm, but it wasn't easy. Finally, they decided to take a break. Sunny ducked inside their tent and came out with a wicker basket and a plaid blanket. She went over to the shade of a big rock near the lake, spread the blanket out, and began unpacking some food. Jill, meanwhile, headed for the safari tent. She discovered a piece of paper under a rock on the folding table, looked at it for a minute, and then waved it in the air. Aunt Catherine left a note, she called across the clearing. She decided to get an early start since she has to set up her camera equipment. She says she'll be out all night, so we shouldn't wait up. Well, what about the bird blind? Asked Sunny. She'll show us tomorrow. Sunny nodded. Want a sandwich? She said, holding up a piece of bread. Sure, said Jill. Be there in a minute. With a flick of her ponytail, she ducked inside the safari tent. We'd heard enough. I nudged Pete, and we inched back from the crest of the hill. So, whispered Pete meaningfully, good old Aunt Catherine will be gone all night, which means, I finished his thought, the coast will be clear. Grinning evilly, we slithered back down. We slithered back down the hill. Chapter 5. An hour later, back at the cove, Pete staggered over to a tree and crumpled against it. He was a wreck. His t-shirt was torn and bloodied. Mud was spattered across his chest. His hair was tangled. His belt hung loose from 2 belt loops, and one of his shoes was missing. "More blood," I told him. "You need a little more blood on your forehead." I squashed some more berries, mixed the juice with a little Chuck's extra thick tomato sauce, and smeared the gooey mess on his forehead. Then I stood back to admire my work. Pete grinned. "How do I look?" he asked. I mashed a fistful of mud on his left shoulder. "Horrible," I said proudly. "Really horrible. In fact, I think I'm going to be sick." We were making our way back to the girls' camp when suddenly we heard their voices ahead of us on the trail. Quickly, we ducked off the trail, circled around closer, and checked out the situation. Jill was down on her knees pouring some white stuff on the ground. It took me a few seconds to figure out what she was doing. She was making a plaster cast of an animal track. I knew because I'd read an article about how to do it, and I had always wanted to try it myself. Sunny, meanwhile, was standing there with her arms crossed in front of her and her weight on one foot, telling Jill all about a book she was reading called Famous Stunt Women of Hollywood. She was saying how one of the stunt women in the book was especially good at jumping onto things like moving trains and stagecoaches and stuff like that. And another woman specialized in falling off things like buildings and cliffs and so forth. Actually, it was all pretty interesting, and I could tell from Pete's expression that he would have liked to stick around and hear more. But we had a job to do, and we had to do it now, before Pete's blood dried up and began looking like tomato sauce. I nudged him, and we melted back into the forest, circled back around to the trail, and started toward the girls. By the time they saw us, Pete was limping along beside me, clutching my arm for support. There was a dazed expression on his face. "Those claws," he was blabbing hoarsely. "Those horrible claws." I heard the girls gasp. Sunny stood frozen, her mouth open. Jill, rising slowly to her feet, dropped her bucket of plaster on the ground, and white liquid poured out over the trail. "Don't worry, Pete," I was saying soothingly. "It's over now. You're going to be all right." "What happened?" blurted Sunny. She was gaping at Pete's torn shirt and bloody wounds, looking horrified. Jill's expression was harder to read, but I thought she looked pretty upset, too. Pete moaned. "It's nothing," I told him. "He's okay. He's just scratched up a little. He was attacked by a wolverine." "A what?" said Jill, shifting her piercing blue eyes to me. "A wolverine. A really big one. Don't let him get me!" screamed Pete, shielding his face with his hands. He began to topple over backward. I caught him just in time. It jumped on him from a tree, I explained. But I have to give Pete credit. He put up a good fight. He fought like a lion. The bit about the lion was Pete's idea. I felt pretty silly saying it, but he'd made me promise to work it in somehow. At least it was better than saying he had fought like a dozen wild Tasmanian devils, which is what he'd really wanted me to say. I told him to forget it. Pete's eyes were wandering, aimlessly focusing on nothing. His head rolled slowly in a sort of circle. What's a wolverine?" Sunny asked, nervously twisting her long blonde hair with her fingers. She'd hardly taken her eyes off Pete. "I've never even heard of one." I'd been counting on that because I hardly knew anything about wolverines myself. All I knew was that they were about 4 feet long, and they look a little like small bears, and they are fierce fighters, and that they can kill animals much larger than themselves. "They're about 4 feet long," I said, "and they look a little like small bears. They're very fierce fighters, and they can kill animals much larger than themselves." So much for the facts. Now for the fantasy. "Actually," I went on, "I think this may have been one of your North American vampire wolverines, because of the way it went for Pete's neck." That shook them up. Even Jill. She looked a little white. "Of course," I added, They don't actually suck blood. It's just that they always kill by going for the soft underside of the neck. This was kind of fun. And tonight, I thought to myself gleefully, was going to be even more fun. A bit of berry juice and tomato sauce oozed down the side of Pete's face and dripped onto his shirt. "Doesn't he need a doctor?" Jill asked me. Pete began to come out of his daze. He lolled his head in Jill's direction and crossed his eyes. "Doctor?" he said weakly. "I think a little first aid should do it," I said, trying to sound like someone who stays cool in an emergency. "I'm going to take Pete over to the mainland to see if I can get some help at the lodge. I just came by to find you so I could warn you about the wolverine before we left." "You think it'll attack again?" Sonny asked in a worried voice. I shrugged. "You know how it is. Once a wild animal has tasted human blood, he's never the same again. But I wouldn't worry about it if I were you. It's a big island. I doubt if he'll be able to find you." I let that sink in for a few seconds, and while I did, a bird suddenly made a fluttering sound in a nearby bush. Jill and Sonny practically jumped out of their tennis shoes. Mission accomplished, I thought. The groundwork had been laid, and it was time to be moving on. "Well, I'll be seeing you," I said casually. "Pete and I'd better get moving if we're going to get back to the lodge before dark." I patted Pete tenderly on the shoulder, and then took his arm. "Ready, old buddy?" I asked him. He perked up. "Go bye-bye?" he asked cheerfully. I turned him around and led him gently away. "We did it!" whooped Pete. "They were scared, really scared." "But not as scared as they're going to be," I said in high spirits. Pete did a spooky version of his whistling wind sound effect. Then, making his voice low and quavery, he said, "As darkness falls over Turtle Island, the dreaded vampire wolverine begins to prowl." He snickered wickedly. "They'll run screaming into the lake." I grinned. "We can only hope," I said.